Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Depending on where you are, the salutations will change. In India, it is a couple of minutes past 4 p.m., couple of minutes past 11:30 a.m. in UK, and 6:30 a.m. in East Coast of USA. First of all, I hope that all of you are well and healthy. My name is Bhagwati Prasad. I'm Associate Dean of the PGDM Healthcare Program at WeSchool, Mumbai. I welcome Professor Dr. Brian Smith and you all to this webinar. Thank you for joining us today in this session. Professor Brian is one of the world's leading authority on evolution of pharma and biotech industry. He is a distinguished academician, author, and leading advisor on competitive strategy for life sciences, pharma, and medtech sector. He has more than 42 years of experience in the industry, and as a consultant, he has published more than 7 books and more than 300 articles and papers. He is a visiting faculty at the University of Hertfordshire, UK, and adjunct faculty at SDA Bocconi, Italy. Topic of today's webinar is the evolution of business models in the life science industry. We will have 10 to 15 minutes of time at the end for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A window to type your questions during the webinar. Let's hear Professor Brian's views on the topic. I welcome you all and Professor Brian once again. Over to you, Professor Brian.
Thank you very much, Bhagwati. Thank you, and hello to everybody on the call. I've heard a lot from all of my contacts about the reputation of Wellincore and WeSchool and PGDM in particular, so I'm very flattered to be able to speak to you today. In this meeting, we have a very varied audience of different ages, different backgrounds, and different ambitions, I guess. But what we all have in common is a curiosity about the future of the life sciences industry. But as the physicist Niels Bohr famously said, predictions are difficult. Predictions are difficult, especially about the future, he said. And I'm not really in the business of making speculative guesses about the future. I'm a generalized Darwinist, that's the name of my academic specialism, I guess, which means that I believe that the ideas of natural selection, that there is variation, selection, amplification, those ideas apply far beyond the realm of biology. And using that science to study our industry, I can see 6 great shifts in the industry's environment that are acting to form selection pressures on our business models. And just as Darwin observed in the speciation of finches on the Galapagos Islands, my work identifies the emergence of 26 different business models in the life sciences industry. And like any good science, that understanding of industry has very practical applications in the real world. So that's the big picture that I want to cover today. So let me begin with the story with some of the science that I want to talk to you about. I guess you're all familiar with a diagram of something like this, but I'm going to cover it slightly or briefly in case you're not, because I assume that in an educated audience like this, most of you are familiar with the basics of Darwinism, but I'm going to introduce you to some specialized terms. The entities which carry information and can be copied, in biology we call these genes, they have a generic name of replicators. So genes are a type of replicator. And they're carried by vehicles that interact with the environment. Genes don't interact directly with the environment. They are carried in a vehicle which interacts with the environment, and those are called interactors. And of course, in biology, the interactor is the body, the organism. So you are an interactor, which is a vehicle which is carrying your genes. And it's the variation and differential selection of these replicators and interactors that leads to the emergence of new species. Now, this is just biology 101, so I'm not going to labor it or talk about it too much. The new idea that I want to introduce you to is that exactly the same thing happens in the life sciences industry, and indeed in other industries, but I research the life sciences industry. In business, the entities which carry information and can be copied, the replicators, are organizational routines. These are little sub-processes for getting things done. And any organization you work in has 1,000 little routines. for everything from ordering stationery to completing an adverse event form in a pharmaceutical company. In business, the interactors or the organizations, like a pharma company or a medtech company. So every company is a vehicle for thousands of routines, and those routines dictate the organization's traits, such as its structure and its strategy. And just as in biology, it is the variation and the differential selection of these replicators and interactors that leads to the emergence of new species. The only difference is that a population of biological organisms with the same traits we call a species. A population of business organizations with the same traits we call a business model. So this, if you like, is generalized Darwinism 101. I'm going to come back to this diagram in a few minutes to remind you of it, but this is the basics that I want to make you familiar with. Generalized Darwinism 201, if you like, is captured on this slide. Again, in biology, and I'm assuming you're familiar with at least some of this, a sequence of base pairs, ACTG, forms a genome, which expresses a proteome, which creates the phenotype of the organism. In business, a sequence of microfoundations forms a routinome, the complete collection of organizational routines, which expresses the capabiliome, which is the complete collection of capabilities, which creates the phenotype of the organization, the pharma type or the medtech company. Now that's about as much of the basic science that we have time for today. I just want you to grasp that there are direct parallels between the two. So when I talk about the evolution of the industry, I'm not using it as a metaphor. I'm not saying that what is happening in the industry is like biological evolution. I'm saying what is happening in the industry is exactly Darwinian evolution. The scientists among you, the management scientists among you will see that this isn't an analog, it's not an analogy or a metaphor. It's an, as Jeff, my friend and mentor Jeff Hodgson calls it, it's an ontological communality. So there are direct parallels. And these direct parallels make it very important from a practical point of view. So if we want to understand the future of the industry, we need to understand this. And in particular, we want to understand this bit. We want to understand how different organizations, different interactors are selected for by the environment. And that leads to the emergence of new species of firm or new business models of firm. So we're interested in how the selection pressures are changing, and we're interested in how that is influencing the evolution in a Darwinian sense of business models. That's what I want us to talk about for a moment. So let me take you in a time machine, okay? I'm very old. So I started in the industry as a research chemist, in fact, in a pharmaceutical company that is now part of Sanofi on the 6th of February, 1978. That's how old I am. And here's a picture of the industry as it was then, as it was described to me then. Okay? In the world that I started in, and it has been for most of the last few decades, doctors decided what to prescribe based on what worked best clinically. Almost all of the market and almost all of the industry was in the West, Western Europe. In those days, even just Western Europe, not even Eastern Europe, or the US and a little bit in Japan. And all of the companies were quite similar to each other. Life science companies in those days, pharma and medtech companies in those days, used to invent their own products, used to make their own products, and used to sell their own products. Medicine, the practice of medicine now was reactive and population-based, using ideas from a guy called Osler that were over 100 years old. Data information use in those days was relatively sparse and used in relatively simple unidirectional ways. Life science companies in those days tried to be good at every part of the value chain. They tried to be good at inventing things, they tried to be good at making things, they tried to be good at selling things. And this was the industry that shaped our industry's evolution in the same way that, for example, the African savanna shaped the evolution of my ancestors and your ancestors. But now look at how that's changed and is changing. Look at the environment that is shaping industry now. and compare it with that. Value is defined not just in clinical terms, but in health economic terms by patients, payers, and prescribers. It's not just prescribers anymore. Both production and consumption of medicines and medical technology is now a global business. It didn't used to be. Firms no longer try to do everything for themselves. In fact, they work as networks. So a big pharmaceutical company or a big medtech company now kind of acts as a hub among a network of partners. Medicine, thanks partly to technological advances and partly to sociological advances, has now become systemic. It's broken away from the Oslerian thinking. For instance, we no longer think of a liver cancer or a lung cancer, we think of a certain type of genotype of cancer. And data and information is now ubiquitous, and the technology to process it is cheap and powerful. And further, investor pressure and technology has polarized companies. So we have now companies that are excellent at making, or selling, or manufacturing, or inventing. Okay. Most pharmaceutical innovation now happens outside of the big companies, for example. And companies no longer try to be good at all three of those parts of the value chain. The colleagues who taught me about the industry when I started in 1978 would barely recognize the business that you and I work in today. And if you think about it for a moment, it would be insane, it would be crazy to expect the industry not to evolve given all of those conditions. And in fact, what happens is those changes, those 6 great shifts, as I call them in my work, act together to have a very complex set of selection pressure implications for the industry. This slide tries to capture those implications, but it's a much more complex picture than this. These changes act together to favor some business models and to disfavor other business models. I'm not going to spend time elaborating on this slide. I can provide, there's more of this material in my books. I can supply you with magazine articles if you'd like to have a short read on these. The key point that you need to take is that the traditional business models, which evolved to fit the old environment that I entered in 1978, those traditional business models are not well adapted to the new environment. 120 years ago, the life science industry's business model was the apothecary, small scale, local, low tech. 60 years ago, the industry was an almost totally unregulated business. 40 years ago, the industry was almost entirely Western. 25 years ago, the pharmaceutical industry was all about small molecules and the medtech industry was all about dumb devices. And all of the evolutionary changes we've seen over that time happened because the environment changed. And all of these changes shown on this slide are about or in the process of changing the industry again. So if we want to predict the future better than Niels Bohr suggested, then we need to understand these changes. I want to elaborate on 2 especially important changes in the industry environment. First, technology and demographics and lifestyle are driving demand of growth in healthcare. If you imagine a hypothetical world where we had unlimited amounts of money, we could spend the amount we could spend on medicines and medtech would grow very, very quickly. It'd be a huge growth rate in demand if we had the money to do it. But historically, most healthcare, especially in the West, has been bought through governments, either directly or by the way that they subsidize insurance schemes. And that spend in practice is constrained by economics, by gross domestic product growth, and by politics. Government and institutional healthcare spending cannot ever keep up with the demand. It's just not technically possible. There are just limits on it. So what is happening is the opening up of a gap, which has always existed, but which is growing. A gap between what governments and institutions and insurance companies can afford to pay for and what it is possible to buy, and therefore what the patient or some patients would like to buy. This opens up a gap, I call it in my work the patient-payer gap, where the patient is the person who decides what is worth buying. And that's a relatively new phenomenon in advanced economies, and it's rapidly becoming so in developing economies too. The second point I want to elaborate on concerns not how value is defined, but on who creates value and how value is created. Value is created by a chain of activities: inventing, making, selling. All companies have to spend enough money to be good enough at each of these things. But as Michael Porter figured out in 1980, companies that try to be excellent at all three things, inventing, making, selling, fail. Successful companies focus on being excellent at either inventing or making or selling, and being just adequate, just good enough at the other two parts of the value chain. As a result, most industries, including our own, polarize into three ways of creating value. Now, this is significant because it shapes the habitat of our industry. Taken together, these two trends combine to fragment our market environment. In the past, the vast majority of spending on life sciences was by governments or insurance companies, and it was on technically innovative products. That's where the market mostly lay, in terms of value at least. What we are seeing now is the growth of a market, but also its differentiation into 9 different habitats, determined by how value is created and by who defines what is valuable. It is this habitat change that is driving the future of the industry. And I want you to hold this picture in your heads as I go into more detail about the evolution of business models in the life sciences industry. A few moments ago, I showed you this diagram to remind you that our industry is evolving by the same processes we see in biology. To be absolutely clear, I'm not drawing a simile or a metaphor. I'm not using a figure of speech. What I'm saying is that what is happening in our industry is not like Darwinian evolution. It is Darwinian evolution. And because what is happening in our industry is Darwinian evolution, we should expect to see something that looks like this. This is the tree of life that shows how evolutionary speciation led to the 8.4 million species of life on Earth, on our planet. So if you look carefully, you'll see that we are only very distantly, you or I are only very distantly related to chlamydia, but we're quite closely related to turtles and crocodiles. And my research is about trying to understand the evolutionary speciation of business models in our industry. So what I'm trying to do is collect information about changes in industry and see what the equivalent of this is. And what I'm going to show you next is what I see when I collect that information. First, we see the models speciate between those that compete with different parts of the value chain. You're familiar with research-based companies competing on technological innovation. Equally, you're familiar with generic and me-too companies who don't really try to innovate. They compete on operational excellence. You might be less familiar with those who compete on customer intimacy, which means enabling the customer to craft a solution around themselves. But we see this in areas like dialysis with Fresenius, or it's increasingly the way that medtech companies like GE and Siemens and Philips are heading towards product as a service. The next decisions involve whether to target institutional customers such as healthcare systems or more consumer-like markets. Then there are a series of decisions about what conditions, what sorts of technologies, what sorts of markets to target. Ultimately, I've identified 26 different sets of decisions, different combinations of decisions. And each of these combinations of decisions is a different business model. Importantly, there is no such thing as the pharma business model or the medtech business model, or even such a thing as the research-based pharma model or the generic business model. There are 26 different variants. And you see examples of each of the 26 in both pharma and medtech. Now, we don't have all day, so I won't go through all of them, and they're detailed in my writing. But for example, you'll recognize some of the well-established models. So if you think about, for instance, about a company like Bayer and their small molecule businesses with Eylea and Xarelto, well, they would fit into this traditional blockbuster model. But you'll also, for instance, if you look at what, say, AbbVie is doing with Humira, when it is looking for increasingly specialized sub-markets, that's the life cycle exploiter model. Perhaps less familiar is the extrinsic nudger model, which is what many of the lifestyle lifestyle apps are trying to develop, where they try to nudge your lifestyle. Or the budget buster model, which is what some of this new gene and cell therapy models are. Or the state gap filler model, which is what many of the self-diagnostic phone apps. So if you've seen these new apps, new devices now for doing an ECG on your phone, that's where they fit. Or if you look at the rare disease model, well, that's the obligation exploiter model. The point is, if you look at enough examples of how business models are changing and use certain methodological techniques, you can see them categorize themselves, splitting them up into 26 different business models. And that's what I see in my work. Another way of looking at exactly the same information is this. It's known as the fitness landscape. If you've done biology at university, you might have come across this. In this diagram, the vertical axis corresponds to evolutionary fitness, or to put it another way, competitiveness. Each of the 26 peaks in this diagram corresponds to one of the 26 different business models from the previous diagram. Importantly, between the fitness peaks lie fitness troughs, which represent the ways that business models can fail. So, for example, a company that tries to be both low cost and innovative tends to produce a value proposition which is neither innovative enough for the innovation seekers nor low cost enough for the generic seekers, and they fall into the market access trough. What evolution can teach us is that there are many ways to succeed as a business, but you have to choose one of them. If you try to straddle, you will fail. In the Amazon, for example, there are thousands of successful species, from piranha fish to the sloth. But there is no such creature as a hybrid between a piranha fish and a sloth, because it wouldn't be evolutionarily viable. So the question, of course, that I'm going to move on to is, how do you evolve your business model into one of the peaks? Okay? And how do you avoid falling into one of the troughs? And that's what I want to cover in my last few slides, if I may. Several times in this session, I've drawn the parallel between the evolution of biology and the evolution in business. But there is one big difference between those two forms of evolution. Life science companies, in biology, evolution is generally driven by a fairly random process of variation. Particularly in sexual species, you get relatively random variation of genomes, and it's the selection of that random variation that leads to evolution. But in life science companies, the variation of routines is not random, or at least it shouldn't be random, because life science companies are not run by random gene shuffling, they're run by intelligent, well-trained human beings. So life science companies can actually choose how they evolve. So whereas biological evolution is random, business evolution ought to be, in theory, it ought to be in practice. It ought to be deliberate. But we have a choice between these. Business executives have a choice between these two routes. You can either opportunistically vary your routines, capabilities, and traits, and move in a relatively undirected way across the fitness landscape, which has a high probability of you falling into a trough, or only a very slow, inefficient climbing of a fitness peak. Or you have the choice to deliberately choose your fitness peak and deliberately and efficiently develop the new routines, capabilities, and traits that your fitness peak needs. Equivalent, if you like, to genetically engineering your organization. In theory, pharmaceutical companies should do the medical technology companies should do the deliberate approach. But in practice, we see them being more or less random. There's an interesting piece of research not carried out in the pharmaceutical industry, carried out across industries, which compares the rate of extinction over geological time of biological species with the rate of extinction of businesses over the last couple of 100 years. Because the theory, of course, would say that deliberate evolution by businesses should lead to much slower evolution, much less extinction, much faster evolution and less extinction than the accidental evolution of nature. But in practice, the two rates of extinction are pretty similar. The person who wrote the paper, Hannah Freeman, I think her name was, famously said, when you look at the evolution of industries, it is as if business managers act at random. And of course, the argument for that is that they do to a large extent because their knowledge and their skills are incomplete. So let me take you back to this diagram for a second and remind you of this diagram. Although it's a complex message I'm trying to get across, and I've written hundreds of thousands of words of this, the essence of it is this. We can look at the parallels between business and biology, and we can deliberately choose what species we want to be. We can therefore say, if I want to be that kind of species, supposing I want to be an obligation exploiter business model in rare diseases, I can see what kind of traits I would need. For instance, one of those traits would be careful design of the extended value proposition around the target audience. That implies certain capabilities, a certain capability. In that example, for instance, you see that all of the obligation exploiter models require the capability to form very good links with patient advocacy groups for their chosen disease. Those capabilities only happen because there are certain routines that underpin them, certain routinomes. And those routinomes are only made possible by certain microfoundations. Microfoundations include the knowledge, skills, and attributes of the individuals in the organization, but they also include how those individuals are connected and organized and how they're led. So what I'm suggesting to you is that this evolutionary theory of how our industry is developing, just like evolutionary theory in biology allows us to intervene in biology, then an evolutionary theory of business allows us to deliberately steer the evolution of our business models. But it's complex. You can't just imitate. I joke sometimes that with my students that imagine if you wanted a chimpanzee to become a business school professor. Well, some of you might think that that's not a very big journey from chimpanzee to business school professor. But of course, you'd very quickly realize that you can't train a chimpanzee to be a business school professor. No amount of training will work because they simply don't have the right genes. They don't have the traits. They don't have a big cerebral cortex. They don't have the power of speech. They can't walk upright. If you really wanted a chimpanzee or any other great ape to be a business school professor, you would have to get your CRISPR-Cas9 kit out and you would have to re-engineer its DNA. And what I'm talking about here on this slide really is the business equivalent of getting out your Cas9 CRISPR kit and re-engineering the processes, capabilities, routines, and micro-foundations of your organization. Of course, this also explains why so many change initiatives are in the current fashion. So some of the digital transformation process fails in so many companies because what they do is they try to change the superficiality of the business model and they don't think about the levels underneath it. In other words, they try to train the chimpanzee and they forget that really what they need to do is to genetically engineer the chimpanzee. So this is my final slide. And if you've been asleep during my presentation, now is the time to wake up. But if you have a good memory, this is the slide I want you to remember. Our industry is not a complicated industry. It is a complex industry. That means it is a complex, adaptive system. We have a body of science that we can use to understand complex adaptive systems. We call it generalized Darwinism. Okay? So our industry is a complex adaptive system. So is the Amazonian rainforest, for example. So we can use generalized Darwinism as a way to understand industry. And to be clear again, I'm not saying it is like Darwinian evolution. I'm saying what is happening in our industry is Darwinian evolution. When you use that paradigm, that way of looking at things, you can see 6 great shifts that are changing industry. Those shifts include the shift away from choosing products according to their clinical benefits to their health economic benefits. Those shifts include the industry going from being a relatively Western industry to a global industry. They include shifts in how we use information. They include shifts in how industries are structured, whether they are single integrated firms or networks of firms, and other great shifts that I talk about in my work. Those 6 shifts act as selection pressures. That is, they select for certain traits of business models and they select against certain traits of business models. So to pick just one example, you will know that if you try to build a pharmaceutical company that was not global, you would fail. If you try to build a pharmaceutical company that did not make extensive use of information, it would probably fail. If you try to build a pharmaceutical company that was completely integrated, as pharmaceutical companies used to be 30, 40 years ago, it would probably be selected against by the environment. And what we see now in the evolution of pharmaceutical companies, when you see announcements from companies, you see the gradual selection for by the environment. So just this week, for instance, Medtronic announced the acquisition of a company that has technology for smart diabetes injectors. Now that is an example of the business model selecting for the environment, selecting for the increased use of the wider use of information. So this selection for and selection against leads to a speciation effect in exactly the same way that Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and saw that a small population of finches that had blown across from South America had landed on different islands, had found on different islands different habitats, and had evolved differently shaped beaks and wings and bodies to adapt to the environment. That's, in biological speak, we call that radiative adaptation. We're seeing radiative adaptation of business models in the pharma and medtech sector. That's what leads to that complex circle that I showed you with it, and 26 different business models. The same thing was shown on the fitness peaks diagram, the 26 fitness peaks. Now that may sound a little abstract to you, but like all good science, you can use it practically. It means you can see where the business models in the industry are evolving, and you can see which one is best or which one is not best for you to evolve into. You can also sometimes use it to split up business models in the same company. So if you look at what, say, Novartis have done with Novartis small molecules, Novartis Oncology, Novartis Sandoz. Okay? What that is a speciation of at least 3 different business models within the same company. If you look at all of those different companies that exist under the Johnson & Johnson medical devices umbrella, you'll see several different business models in that area. And importantly, you can use this information to direct your own evolution or the evolution of your own business model. So just as if I wanted a chimpanzee to speak, I would know that I would need to do genetic engineering to give it a FOXP2 gene. And for the geneticists among you, I know it's much more complicated than that. But for example, I would know certain genes that my new species would need. Then with a business model, I would know certain processes, capabilities, and routines that my new business model would have. And I don't need to evolve them in a haphazard, a random way. I can do it in a very deliberate way. That's how the science would guide the evolution of the industry. But remember that that doesn't happen with most industries. What happens with most industries is that companies, because they don't understand the science or they don't understand what's going on, they make mistakes and they give the impression of wandering more or less randomly and opportunistically across the fitness landscape, which is why many of them die. Okay? It's hard to imagine, and for us, for instance, that companies like, say, Novartis or Pfizer or Medtronic might eventually become extinct. But if you look at the list of the top 50 pharmaceutical companies of today and compare it to the top 50 pharmaceutical companies of, say, 30 or 40 years ago, you'll see a huge change. And we see that in all sectors. If I ask you what mobile phone you have in your pocket right now, you probably have an Apple or perhaps a Samsung or one of a very small number of companies. Probably most of you don't have a Nokia. And yet 20, 30 years ago, Nokia dominated the industry. So business models and companies can go extinct just like species can. In fact, they will go extinct, I would argue, unless they make a deliberate choice to choose the path of their own evolution. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I think I've spoken for about 35, 40 minutes, and then I will now gladly take any questions that you have. Professor Prasad, do you want to take the microphone?
Yeah. So I request all the participants to post questions in the Q&A window. So maybe I can begin by asking you one question, Professor Brian. My question is, like, most of your strategy related, these are suggestions, and they seem to be after some things have happened, then we are saying that something has succeeded or not succeeded. Can you give some guidance about, is there a possibility to predict what business models are likely to succeed and what business models are likely to fail?
So your question essentially is, can you use evolution as a predictive science?
Right, right.
There's a great deal of debate about that. The short answer is only little, and really what you're doing is not predicting. What you can do is if you know how the environment is changing, you can anticipate responses to it and look for them happening. So, if I'd have said to you, if we go in our time machine, went back 6 million years to Africa and noticed that the rainforest was thinning out into the savannah, we might have predicted the rise of a species of primate that walked upright, had big brains, and talked. But it's a very imprecise way of predicting, and in fact, a better way to do it is, because the system is a complex adaptive system, you have to look for these emergent properties of the system. So essentially, when I show you those maps, they're not really predictions. Or even when I wrote them, they were not predictions. They were very, very early stage identifications of what I saw was happening. So I gathered literally thousands and thousands of news stories about companies launching, companies exiting, companies merging, companies making changes, and I gradually, using methods I won't bore you with now, organize them into patterns. And that, I won't say that predicted the future. It allowed me to see the emergence of the answers. Rather than predicting them, it allowed me to see them emerging earlier than other people have. And what I find interesting is that I wrote the first book on this theme, Future Pharma, in 2011, and the Darwin's Medicine I wrote in 2017. And I've been delighted and proud of the way that those business models have evolved in the way that I anticipated. So the short answer to your question is, you can use it. You can't really use evolutionary science predictively. You can use it in a way that looks like prediction by looking for the early emergence of signals. Hope that happens.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Brian. We have some question on the chat window as well, so maybe you can look at the questions on chat window as well as Q&A window, both the windows.
Yes. Okay.
Now we have a couple of questions.
Okay, so let me look at those questions and answer. So Pallavi asks an interesting question. Do you feel that every successful business model should be a mix of both spontaneous and deliberate evolution, or only deliberate planned evolution? Well, in the perfect world, it would be deliberate planned evolution, Pallavi. But the reality is we don't live in a perfect world, and our information is imperfect. I think that we should try to plan our evolution. And I think that using that planning and deliberation would accelerate our evolution. But I don't think we have the knowledge or the skills or the capabilities to be 100% planned. In exactly the same way, if you take the metaphor of, when we completed the Human Genome Project, we said, right, we know the human genome now, we can know everything, can't we? And in the intervening 20 years, we've discovered that actually it's a lot more complicated than that, all of the interactions between genes and so on. It's the same thing. So the answer to your question is, well, I'd like to be 100% deliberate and planned, but in reality, we can't be. That doesn't mean, however, just like in genetics, that the knowledge we have can't help us. I hope that helps. Mithiel asks me an interesting question. Mithiel Vyas, how will digitalization bring changes to the life science industry? Well, there's two things there. You can't answer that question because you have to, well, or if you want to answer that question, you have to define what you mean by digitization. And digitization is a huge term. It means 1,000 different things. In fact, if I got 1,000 people in a room and asked them all to tell me what digitization in the life science industry means, I would get at least 1,000 definitions. So you'd have to be more precise. That said, digitization is an aspect of what I call the information shift, a shift away from using relatively small amounts of information in a unidirectional manner to using large amounts of data in a bidirectional manner. Okay, and that is causing many changes in the industry, but it is not the information. So digitization is part of information shift. Information shift is part of the changes facing the industry. And the point is that, remember, this is a complex adaptive system. Okay, you can't be reductionist about this. This isn't like chemistry that I was trained in originally. You can't say X will cause Y. That's not how complex adaptive systems work. Okay, so you can't say digitization will cause this. You can say digitization is part of the information shift. And the information shift, along with the other 5 great shifts in our environment, appear to be causing this. Okay? But it is far too simplistic to say any one thing, including digitization, will cause another thing. That kind of takes me on to my the third question is there from Shital Sipi, who asks, post-COVID, what kind of business models would seem redundant? I can direct you to an earlier webinar I gave about strategy after COVID, and you'll find it on my YouTube channel. But I don't think, this is going to sound crazy to you, but I don't think COVID makes much difference. I just pause for a moment. You've just heard a professor say he thinks COVID makes very little difference. What I mean is that COVID will accelerate and it will amplify what is already happening. Okay? But I don't think it changes the direction of what's already happening. So let me give you one example. I recently put a post on LinkedIn asking for comments about things I should cover in my next book, which is about how the industry is adapting to the future. And one of the speakers on that said, well, the big change is that we can no longer see clinicians, doctors, and so on face to face. And now that's a good example, because if I take you back 6 months ago or a year ago before COVID, and you talk to people in pharmaceutical and medtech companies and say, what is one of the changes that is happening in your industry? They would have said then, before COVID, they would have said, increasingly it is difficult to see clinicians. So that is an example of COVID not changing the direction of the market, but simply accelerating and amplifying it. So I refer you to the presentation, both the one on YouTube and this one, Shital. I don't think, and again, it comes back to this complexity issue, I don't think you can say COVID will do this or COVID will not do that. COVID is one thing in a complex environment. Okay? And on its own, I don't think it will change anything. I think it will perhaps accelerate and amplify things that were already happening. So to pick another example, one of our speakers on our call is an expert in global health and public health. Now, one of the things that COVID will do is it will make public health much more prominent than it has been. and we will no longer be able to treat public health as a relatively poor relation that doesn't get much money. Now, so public health will be able to demand more money because of COVID, but that money still comes from the same pot. So it means other areas of healthcare will get less money. So it will put more pressure on demonstrating health economic value for money. So that is a result of COVID, but that trend was happening already. So that is an example of COVID accelerating and amplifying what was already happening. I hope that makes sense. Are there any more questions? I will gladly take one. I think I've addressed those three questions.
Okay, I request participants to type their questions in Q&A window. I have one more question. Maybe this time it is technical in some sense. So, for example, you talked about genetic engineering, but if we talk about stem cell engineering or genetically modified crops, they are illegal or not allowed in many of the countries. So any thoughts about it? I know it's a technical question, not the business related, but I thought I can
You mean,
ask.
do I have any questions about genetic engineering in a biological sense? And genetically
Right,
modified
right.
Well, I suppose I have two thoughts. As you know, here in Europe, when we ban genetically modified organisms, I think eventually GMOs will become ubiquitous. I think that goes without saying. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a co-evolutionary issue of the science is advancing more quickly than the social system of regulation. So it's a little bit like, you know, how hummingbirds and flowers evolve together to sort of, the flower would gradually get deeper and the hummingbird's tongue would gradually get longer. And we've got a kind of mismatch of the situation at the moment. But I think the economic and practical benefits of genetic engineering will become so ubiquitous that eventually those two things will accommodate each other. But there is another side to that. One of the reasons that there is a great deal of resistance to GMOs in Europe is not, there are lots of lunatics who think that, you know, there are health problems with it, but actually the real issue is an economic one, that you may allow companies like Monsanto, and I know this is an evolving situation, companies like Monsanto to dominate the market, okay? And that would be bad for competition. The same thing, the parallel thing in healthcare might be, you know, we are very quickly getting to the stage where we can engineer the germline. So if I want my children to have blue eyes or musical ability or something, I might be able to engineer that in the germline. And there are ethical issues and social issues around that. So you have to remember that the technological environment and the social environment are evolving with each other. They are co-evolving. And that's what's holding up. So, you know, personally, I don't have any scientifically ethical issues with GMOs, but I do have some concerns socially about their regulation and competition in markets and manipulation of markets by large global companies.
Thank you for answering that question.
My pleasure.
We have one question in the chat window from Dharya.
Okay, let me just see if I can find that. I've got a pop sign. I can't see that at the moment.
Okay, I will read it out. Yeah, go ahead, Sangamitra.
The question is, what are some current trends in biotechnology industry?
Well, gosh, that is such a huge question. There are huge, and of course, it also depends on how you define the biotechnology industry. One of the things I think is interesting is that the blurring between the labels, you know, we traditionally think of biotech and big pharma and small molecule, and the blurring between all of those lines. So it depends what you exactly mean by biotech, and it depends exactly. And there are, and even within the traditional definition of biotech, there are so many changes. The one I'm finding most interesting actually is not scientific. Well, at least it is not to do with life sciences, biology. It's actually to do with their business models and their capabilities. One of my PhD students at Hertfordshire is researching, and we've just written a paper on this, is researching the nature of these asymmetric R&D deals, you know, where a large company buys intellectual property from a biotech. And what's evolving is for that to work well, it requires a lot more than just a good molecule and good marketing of the molecule by the big company. So it requires a lot more than just good scientists and good marketers. There's a particular capability set usually in the business development department of pharmaceutical companies for structuring the deal so that risk is mitigated, because remember this is a high uncertainty, high risk environment, and that so that the synergies between the partners are maximized as well as possible. So I think the most interesting trend is that those companies are becoming much smarter at how they structure their deals. I think that's probably the most interesting thing that I'm seeing. Yeah. So there's an anonymous attendee who asks, are government health programs also governed by Darwinian principles? Well, I would argue that they are, but I've not studied them. Okay, I think we are seeing some evolutionary trends. So, for instance, if I take the healthcare system that I know best, the UK's healthcare system, the famous National Health Service, you know, I can see that the increase in demand caused by demographics and lifestyle is selecting against its traditional models, its traditional state-provided models, and we see that just to give two examples of that. You know, one, for instance, is that the traditional healthcare system that we have in Western Europe is not going to be able to finance at large scale the immuno-oncology revolution, and it's not going to be able to finance at large scale the gene and cell revolution for congenital diseases. So we can see that environment will select against the traditional model in that respect. But it is going to select for telehealth. So, and this is an example where COVID has not changed the direction, but it's accelerated the direction. So, you know, many times in the past, I've wanted to me and my family have wanted to make a small, have a small conversation, short conversation with my family doctor. It's usually, you know, about something very trivial. And especially with my level of knowledge, I can usually describe my symptoms very well to the doctor and say, look, you know, I think I probably just need, you're the doctor, but I probably just need some augmentin because it's just a simple bacterial infection or something. Or some steroids because it's a skin rash that won't resolve itself or something. But the system is that I have to go, take time off work and go and sit in a germ-filled doctor's surgery and take up 10 minutes of the doctor's time. But now, because of COVID, I can snap my fingers and make a telehealth appointment that takes a fraction of the time and is much more efficient. And that is an example of the environment selecting for changes in the healthcare system. So I think the answer to your question is, yes, they are. Health systems are governed by the same Darwinian rules, but I can't talk about them in anything like the same detail because I haven't researched them. And unlike some professors, I prefer not to talk about things that I'm not expert in. Any other questions? Oh, this is an interesting from Mark Eric Baudouin. And this is talking about organizing, particularly large, I guess, Mark Eric, you mean pharmaceutical medtech companies failing to evolve organically because they're so large. There's some really interesting parallels with biology here. you know, your genes, of course, are mutating all the time. There are millions and millions of mutations in your body all the time, and by and large, your system kills those mutations, and it has to, otherwise cancer would run wild. The same metaphor runs in a large company. All sorts of little changes and routines are happening all the time, and by and large, the system works against it. It has standard operating procedures and systems that squash that change. And as a result, organic change in large organizations is slow and difficult. But to be clear, although when you work in a large corporation, as I did for 20 years, it is extremely frustrating that building to make change. It is the opposite side of the coin to, if you allow too much change, it would be dangerous. Your point about mergers and acquisitions is an interesting one, because of course it's directly analogous to getting genes from outside, either through sex. So, you know, sex is you know, in one of my articles I wrote that sex is a good idea. You know, sexual reproduction is a great idea because of the shuffling of genes that it creates. And companies can quite often get ideas from outside, either by merger and acquisition or perhaps through consultants or something like that. The problem is that what most pharmaceutical companies do when they look for new ideas, let's say they look for new ideas about how to segment the market or whatever, or how to write a strategy or something. Okay, the problem is they go to consultants who only work in the industry, who only understand, who really only have the same ideas as they have. So I work for GSK, I bring in a consultant from McKinsey, but the McKinsey consultant used to work for Pfizer. And so the ideas circulate within the industry. It's very incestuous. It's, you know, if we stick with the sex metaphor, then, you know, what happens in most consultancy is it's like having sex with your cousin. You don't really get new genes in. You get old, you just exchange the old genes. The other metaphor in that area, of course, is many times in biological history, organisms have captured other genes, like so the mitochondria in your cell, for example, or the result of capturing a bacterium billions of years ago. And sometimes we can do that. The problem is that you can acquire a small company and capture some of its routines. The problem with doing that is that many times what companies do is they absorb the genes and destroy them. So you absorb a small company and then you destroy what they do by making them comply with your systems. Which is why, for instance, companies like Sanofi and Roche, when they acquired Genzyme and Genentech, they kept them at arm's length and kept them as a separate unit, a bit like a mitochondria is a separate unit in your cell. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that metaphor is not too stretched. I hope that makes sense to you.
I have a question, Professor Brian.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so do you feel the role of salesperson in the pharmaceutical and medtech industry becoming redundant or extinct in the near future, specifically with the usage of technology and digital tools?
I'm sorry, Sangarita, I lost that slightly. Can you repeat it?
So do you feel the role of a salesperson in pharmaceutical and the medtech industry becoming redundant in future, especially with the usage of technology and digital tools?
Okay, I gave this. I ran a project on this very recently with a large pharmaceutical company. To get the answer, you have to think like an evolution scientist. Yeah, species usually don't go extinct completely. Okay, so I don't think sales teams will go extinct. So if I ask you for an archetype, a stereotype of something that went extinct, you might well mention the dinosaurs. But I went out into the front of my house this morning, and 2 dinosaurs had crapped on my car. If you'll excuse my expression. They were birds, because some dinosaurs evolved into birds. So the question really is not will sales forces go extinct? And Mark, Eric, I'll come back to your other question in a moment. It's not really will sales forces become extinct, but how will they speciate? And I think we know the answer to that already. It is very clear that what I would call the dumb sales force, the really not very expert, very large detailing sales force, will become extinct and will be replaced by remote detailing and digital methods, a combination of digital selling. But at the same time, another species will spin off, and we're seeing this already, of very small, very expert salespeople. And at the moment, we call these people medical science liaison. Now, in the industry, they will scream and go, oh no, a medical science liaison person is not a salesperson. But it is. It's just a different variety of one. So I think the answer to your question is, we will see the disappearance of the traditional sales force, large detailing sales force, but its replacement with two other species, the remote detailing sales force and the specialized medical science liaison sales force.
Thank you.
I'm going to return to Mark Eric's question because I don't think I answered it very well. His question is really about what this cycle does to diversity, which is an essential variable to promote balanced access to health. Well, presumably you're meaning gender. Eric, Mark Eric, I'm going to assume that you mean racial and ethnic and gender diversity. Well, and that you're assuming that you're saying it's an essential variable to promote balanced access to health. Well, I don't know if that's true. I think you're doing what we call in English, if that is what you're saying, I may be misjudging you. You may be doing what the English call begging the question. That means asking a question that assumes its premise. Okay, so when I wandered into the kitchen this morning and said to my wife, "Where is my cup of coffee?" she said to me, "Well, you are assuming that I'm going to make you a cup of coffee." Okay, you are kind of assuming that diversity is an essential variable to promote balanced access to health. I don't know if that's true. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying it is true. I just don't know because that's not an area that I cover. I think diversity is an important part of social justice, but I'm not sure what its connection is to promote balanced access to health. I think balanced access to health is a much, much more complex issue. I'm personally very politically aligned to, but I think it's a very complex issue. It's very much more than diversity of people within the company. Let me see if I can see any other questions.
Brian, Rohan
Yes.
here.
Hi, Rohan.
Yeah, so I have a question out of curiosity. So there is a concept of genetic shift and genetic drift.
Oh, yes.
It typically happens in viruses, a lot of accumulation of mutations and you find a completely new virus. So do you think such kind of a drift could also happen with respect to business models?
Yeah, well, it undoubtedly does. It undoubtedly does. So, in selection pressures and genetic drift is a result of a selection pressure. And selection pressures really fall into two categories. There are those selection pressures which eliminate part of the population. So, for instance, if I take you in my time machine to 1960 and so the entire population of pharmaceutical companies did not really do regulatory approval. Okay, so things like the thalidomide disaster, which you might have read about in history, occurred because basically there was no such thing as clear for clinical trials and regulatory approval. And then by 1970, all of those business models which did not have the trait of regulatory rigor were extinct. And they've been replaced, all of the business models that evolved into. That's an extreme example of a kind of genetic drift created by a selection pressure, the selection pressure for regulatory approval, which acted in purely one direction. It made the population less diverse. Okay. The other type of selection pressure is a selection pressure that makes the population more diverse. So that is when there's a selection pressure that can be addressed by more than one adaptation. And the example of that I've given in my talk today, there is selection pressure for increased return on investment, increased risk-adjusted return on investment. And where the companies there are three ways the companies can do that. They can either become even more technologically innovative, or even more customer oriented, or even more operationally efficient. And what they can't do is stay being mediocre or average, all three of those things. So that selection pressure has led to that diversification of business models. I think most of what we're seeing in the industry is diversification selection pressure, but there are some things like ethical behavior that are gradually creating a genetic drift towards more ethically compliant business models. But it's a good question. You're right to identify that. There are so many parallels between biological evolution and business evolution, and that's because they are not metaphors or analogies of each other. They are ontological communalities in Jeff Hodgson's term. They are the same thing.
Great. Thank you for answering that, Brian. I'll definitely like to be in touch with you and to explore this in much detail later on. Yeah.
Well, yes, that would be lovely. I'd like to do that, and I would love it. Perhaps if COVID and other things allow, it would be terrific to come and to meet you guys in person in Mumbai.
Great. We look forward to that as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions? Or have we've overrun on time a little bit? That's fine with me, but I'll gladly take more questions. Or if Professor Prasad wants to wrap up the event, then that's okay too.
So I would like to ask the participants, if there are any more questions, you can type it into the Q&A box. We'll just wait for a minute to see if there are any
Yes,
other questions.
I'm looking carefully at the box. I think I may have put everybody to sleep.
So I guess there are no more questions.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Brian, for sparing your time for this webinar. It was an insightful session, and it has been an enriching experience for all of us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and you are very, very welcome indeed. I hope we can do this again some other time, or either remotely or in person.
We would definitely take some key takeaways from this session and apply it to the real life scenario. And your analogy on the Darwinian evolution of species and its application to pharmaceutical and the medtech industry was enthralling. So thank you so much for your time. I would also like to thank Santosh and Dr. Rohan for their support for this webinar. And thank you all the participants for attending this webinar. Have a great weekend ahead. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye now.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor Brian. See you again.
Thank you, Professor Brian, and look forward to be in touch with you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Brian. It was a really nice, good session.